Crystal Mowry, Lisa Myers, and myself sat down probably 2 years before the Black Drone show, and we sat down and we talked about what was going to happen with that. And we were like, wouldn't it be amazing if this was the thing that would change everything? And we kind of knew it would, but we didn't know how it would happen, and we were mostly concerned about keeping our act together so that we could shepherd it out into the world and not have that get picked up by somebody else before us, right? But we thought about, we fantasized about changing the story. And then now we're at this place where we're actually changing the story. It is doing the thing that we imagined. So I'm not quite emotionally prepared for the impact of it. You know, there's the distinction between the fantasy, and that's the driving impulse for your work for your whole career, right? I didn't think it would be in my lifetime that it would shift. It's just such a weird moment for this to be my moment. So much hate in the world. And maybe being okay with that being my skill set, I guess, you know? But it's a lot. But I'm thankful for Crystal, and we got through the Black Drones show with all of that weight. Levi Carroll, this beautiful one-legged former slave who fought in the Civil War and lives in this schoolhouse, and knowing that he was smack dab in the middle of town, right, obviously speaks to the fact that there are a whole bunch of other folks that obviously knew who Levi Carroll was, right? And again, that ability to collectively forget people, right? Undesirables. Well, I thought it was really interesting that this black man was probably one of the oldest figures in the town, and that he is completely forgotten. The building he lived in is remembered, but he's not remembered. And I just was like, wow, that's off the hook and crazy. That's some effort right there. You know what I'm saying? All of that stuff was very neat and tidy and sanitized into this little story of this white German enclave that had nobody else around it, right? And that's just wrong, right? That's just a gift to like get me going on, like, well, I just need to correct that. And then in finding Levi in the city directories and in the German newspapers, and like, you know, seeing Levi Carroll, this slave story in hard German, old German, is like, that's incredible, right? And the way that he was written about in those old German newspapers was much more generous than the latter, right? So there was a feeling of heartfelt kind of connection with this man, and then something happens as the town turns towards industrialization, right? Levi gives me an opportunity to think of the day-to-day activities, what that was like, but it also gives me an opportunity to think through white exploitation and white theft, and the ways that people's land was taken from them, and the way that slavery is never mentioned in Berlin, except that it was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. You'll never find that in a book, right? It's in Black history books. And again, Berlin is just a super interesting town. It's an interesting story that omits so much of itself in it. And I guess that's what the Black Drones points to, is there's so much story in that little spot. And it's a fraction of like the whole country, right? But just imagine all of these little spaces that have these super important histories. They're all grounded in everyday people, right? You know what I mean? Like, there's just so much to pull out of it. And if you can pull out a couple of characters out of the town, you can kind of pull out a whole chapter worth of a story, right? So Levi Carroll is slavery. It's what else is it? It's the name change, the Berlin name change. You've got Kaiser Wilhelm, Levi Carroll, and the creation of the first industrialized factory. And I have these questions about what do you do with excess human labor? And I think that's actually a real simple, but actually really important question to be asking about Southern Ontario and Kitchener-Waterloo, is like, what do you do with all of that excess labor that they framed as feeble or, you know, poor, or whatever the logic was. But the relationship between the settlement of Kitchener-Waterloo, the creation of Berlin, and the Waterloo House of Refuge and Industry, that is a story. It just unravels. It just completely unravels, and you just see how everything is connected to everything. And that's the attraction of it, frankly. It's like there's no end, because There's no end, you know? Underneath all of these exhibitions is the core question of how did we become who we became? How did this family become who we are? My grandmother was the keeper of secrets, right? And then she would teach us the lineage by orally kind of repeating it over and over again. This person's from this person and did all that kind of stuff. And then my mom and I do this all the time, right? I guess what I'm mapping out is a kind of a family tree. And from that place, then I can see it, you know? I think by nature of growing up with old people, and then my mom's generation, and thinking about how the family has always talked in history, we talk a lot about back in the day. Who's who, when, who did that, all that kind of stuff. An oral history kind of oriented family, right? And we don't tell stories the same way. It's not an A to B, because there's a ton of trauma in between all of that takes the story every which way, right? So I'm trying to tell that story because that's the way that the world happens, right? There's history that functions around us every day, right? And I guess, yeah, I grew up in a context in which there were all kinds of different stories happening at the same time, and that was my present tense reality. And I'm trying to articulate that because that's the world. I mean, that's how we all live, right? It's not a linear narrative. That linear narrative that we've been taught is more like a strategy to indoctrinate more than it is inherently to actually say something or tell a story about something. I just wanted to point out this thing. So the time frame we're talking about is this time frame, right? So the time frame of the cluster is this, right? And so the lived experience is my grandpa's time frame, right? And I've heard some of those stories, but I haven't heard all of them, right? So this gives me a way to, to understand him. And then out of that, I have a way to understand how she was raised, and then down the line, right? That's part of the ambition of it all, right? Charles was the first person I met when I came to Montreal. Just happens to be a faculty member at Concordia. I just got hired at Concordia. It was lovely. My favorite book on the planet is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It is my Bible. I love that book. And so Charles let slip something like, oh yeah, he's a cousin or something. And I was just like, just stop it, man. Like, what are you even saying to me? He's like a legit hardcore jazz player. He does runs in that whole American scene. He's got a place in the world with them. He's taught some of them. He's like he's a trip. He's a cool cat, as he would say. And I was like, I love this guy. And we did the recording, and I just thought to ask him at the end of all of it, have you ever heard about this place called the Harlem Nocturne, which is the club that our family ran, right? You actually, yeah, she know because she waitressed there, right? So you know that place, yeah?
Yeah, I do.
So I asked him if he knew about the Nocturne, and he just kind of looked at me and he's like, oh yeah, that spot in Vancouver. And he just told me all about it. It's a connection to the whole West Coast jazz thing. It was like one of those places that the black performers went to, right? And I was like, that's some cool beans. So I read it as like a total sign that I was in the right spot, because here comes this cat. He's related to the guy that wrote my favorite book on the planet. And he's doing this piece for me, and he's such beautiful, warm, lovely energy. And, he's got his whole black political thing going on, and I just love him to death. And then add to it that he knew the club. It was just like, yep, this man's supposed to be here. That's the thing. It has to be beautiful to some. And maybe that's why this is perhaps successful, right? If I were to come out here on a platform with a suit and tie and all that business and said, Canada's a racist state and da-da-da-da-da-da, and this is why, nobody'd listen to me. Nothing attractive about that at all, right? And I think with the Invisible Empire show, I learned that I kind of figured out fairly early on that I was going to have to seduce people into this conversation, right? So beauty to sell the ugly. And I was early on deeply interested in the idea of whether or not I could sell back this darkness, right? To sell it back to largely, from Canadian context, largely white buyers. If I could figure out a way to take what they've done and turn it around and God, get paid for it, fabulous, right? And if they desire it, well, that's just even better. In the thinking through of, changing a mindset, if this became something that was desirable and valuable, well, that's just exciting, right? And that is what this was about, is about selling something horribly repugnant, and trying to make this knowledge valuable. Because it wasn't, no one wanted to hear from me. And the number of arguments I was having with people every time I had a show about, why are you doing this? Why are you dredging this up? This is painful. We don't want it, right? But the story, what drove me was her experiences, my grandparents' experiences, and I'm surprised. I'm surprised that people are giving me space to do it, because it seems like such a well-kept secret for so long that I could be able to be that person, just kind of trot out and do that. I'm not sure if it's a matter of they didn't see me coming, or maybe they didn't think I could find what I found, or I'm not sure. But it's worth considering, because there are a lot of people that didn't do the digging before me. And what does that mean, right? And what did they consent to in not doing the digging, yeah? And so that's why it's not linear, and that's why it's all over the place, and that's why it's wide open. The network of people that were working to oppress racialized folks is, significant. And I think that people need to know about it. So I follow the leads till I get all of them, or something like that. I am thorough. I am thorough.